It gives me great pleasure now to welcome back to the stage for the second time this year Dr. David Talcott, who's the holder of the NSA Lectureship for the year. The lectureship is entitled Plato, a Christian Appraisal. He's flown all the way from New York, where he's professor of philosophy at King's College and has a book forthcoming on Plato, coming out with P&R Publishing. So please give a very warm welcome to Dr. David Talcott.
It's good to be with you again this afternoon. I am not British, and hopefully I will not disappoint you. So I realize it's a busy weekend, and thank you for being here. Plato lived from 427 to 347 BC in Athens, Greece. At the time of his birth, Athens was the most powerful state in all the Mediterranean. Together with Sparta, they had forced back the Persians in 479 BC. But in Plato's day, those glories were in the past. Semi-distant memories, like World War II is for us. In his 20s, he saw his city lose a multi-decade war against her arch-rival. Sparta defeated Athens in a great naval battle in 405 BC. And soon thereafter installed a non-democratic government of 30 tyrants. This was a disaster for the city itself, but it was an opportunity for the city's aristocrats. Whenever a democracy is defeated, the regime that takes its place is likely to be more favorable to the elites, who will use the opportunity to consolidate power away from the many in favor of the few. Plato himself was right in the thick of it. He was born into an aristocratic family and was positioned to profit immensely from these political changes. He tells us in his 7th letter that this was a moment of incredible opportunity and hope. He writes, "When I was a young man, I had the same ambition as many others. I thought of entering public life as soon as I came of age. Certain happenings in public affairs favored me. Some of these men, the 30 tyrants and their core team, happened to be relatives and acquaintances of mine, and they invited me to join them at once in what seemed a proper undertaking." So he was invited to join the new team of leaders under this Spartan established regime. And he thought it was a proper undertaking. Why would it have been proper to do this? Well, he tells us he genuinely thought that this new group was going to lead the city out of the unjust life she had been living and establish her in the path of justice. The city had indeed been living an incredibly unjust life. For decades, it had extracted tribute from the subject cities around the Eastern Mediterranean. Though Athens did deserve credit for its role in helping to repel the Persians from Hellas 3 generations earlier, they had gradually overreached their place. Colonizing, exploiting, and crushing dissent had become their new normal. Their expansionism is what led Sparta, a cautious and modest people despite their brutal militarism, to initiate war. Sparta, in fact, justified her actions in that war on the ground that she was bringing freedom and liberation to the Greeks, a freedom which Athenian hegemony threatened. So Plato was a man familiar with the attractions and the dangers of political power. Though he was still young, his relatives offered him a position in the newly reconstituted government. Athens needed reform. Plato had motive and opportunity to be a great man in public life. But he didn't take the job. He turned it down. He kept political ambition with him his whole life, but he never acted on it in Athens. He could have been at the very heights of power in his mid-20s, like being appointed to the White House legal staff fresh out of law school. Why didn't he do it? Well, in his 7th letter, he tells us that before throwing his hat into the ring, he first moved cautiously. He watched them eagerly to see what they would do. And what he saw shook him right down to his very core. He writes, as I watched the tyrants and what they were going to do with their new regime, they showed in a short time that the preceding constitution had been a precious thing. The corruption of our written laws and our customs was proceeding at such an amazing speed. I was appalled and drew back from that reign of injustice. Plato's optimism at having his team in power vanished when he saw the reality. His relatives had gained control of the city, but their government turned out to be just as poor as what it replaced. One injustice exchanged for another. The city and her citizens not truly benefited. Why had his relatives failed? Why couldn't they lead the city out of her unjust way of life? Plato spent the rest of his life seeking to give a proper answer to those questions, trying to figure out how young people can be educated so that they can rule with justice, trying to understand how a nation can be restored to holiness and rectitude, staying within its limits. He realized in his youth that long-term successful government requires moral preparation. Ethics comes before politics. And he himself turned decisively away from politics and towards philosophy, pursuing a project of moral, intellectual, and spiritual reform that he came to realize was a necessary prerequisite for good government. So today, as we continue to assess Plato, to first seek to understand him and then to start to assess him, I want to explore Plato's basic conclusions in these areas: how we should live and how we should organize our political life together. So first, Plato's ethics. In the last lecture, we explored Plato's metaphysics and epistemology. We saw his unrelentingly spiritual orientation to the world. He rejected materialism as inadequate to explain the true order of the universe. Instead, there's a world of true being that goes beyond what we perceive with our eyes and ears. This physical world is a reflection of that spiritual one, and an increasingly better reflection as physical things participate in the spiritual more and more fully. In the words of scholar Lloyd Gerson, what is most distinctive about Platonism is that it is irreducibly top-down rather than bottom-up. A top-down approach to philosophical problems rejects the claim that the most important and puzzling phenomena we encounter in this world can be explained by seeking the simplest elements out of which these are composed. That is, to understand the world, you cannot just look downward, breaking matter into its smallest pieces, trying to go to atoms, to subatomic particles, to quarks, to strings, and then whatever else we discover, and think that these things will ultimately tell you how and why everything is happening. To understand the world in the full analysis, you have to look up to non-physical spiritual realities. As we turn from metaphysics to ethics for today, we see right away that in Plato, the ethics depends upon the metaphysics. And this is ultimately true for all philosophies. How you think we should live is driven by your view of the world and humanity's place within it. Just as Plato rejected metaphysical materialism as failing to see the spiritual that is in the material, Plato also rejects the standard ethical accounts of his day, and for the same reason. They did not look high enough. He targets two views in particular that I now want to explore with you. They were the main ancient rivals to Platonism in his day, at least among the elites. And they're two of the main rivals today to Christian ethics. So first is a way of life based on living for the sake of pleasure. Living for the sake of pleasure. And second is a way of life living for the sake of power. So pleasure and power. These are the main rivals that he spends a great deal of ink arguing against and seeking to defeat. So first, pleasure seeking. There's a simple name for philosophical views which hold that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. That name is hedonism. According to hedonism, everything else is to be pursued for the ultimate purpose of acquiring more pleasure. This view was not an invention of the 20th century. It was widespread in antiquity. And of course, it's not hard to see why. Pleasure feels good. When you're trying to decide what to do, the question, will I enjoy it? Will it be fun? Will it make me feel good? That often seems like it's a front and center consideration. In antiquity as today, there were wiser and more foolish hedonists. Some slophead hedonists simply chase whatever pleasure is in front of them. Plato thought many of his contemporaries lived that way. Get what you can, however you're able to get away with it. But there were also a bit smarter hedonists. Epicurus, a philosopher just a few generations after Plato, is perhaps the most articulate ancient advocate for this kind of view. It may perhaps be Lucretius, but he's hundreds of years after Plato. Epicurus recommended virtue as the best pathway to pleasure. Now, that's a much wiser and more sane kind of hedonism. But ultimately, all hedonisms reduce the moral life to the material level. Life becomes about the here and now, so live as pleasantly as possible. This is why materialist views have often trended towards hedonism. If this life is all there is, and this life is just atoms moving in the void, then trying to get your atoms in the most pleasant arrangement possible seems like the way to go. Epicurus and Lucretius were both atomists. Early modern materialists like Thomas Hobbes also adopt a view like this hedonistic view. So Plato directly argues against hedonism. Let me give you two of his arguments that he uses from the dialogue, the Gorgias. If pleasure was the true explanation for something being good, then there would be nothing pleasurable that was not also good. The pleasurableness of something and the goodness of something would go hand in hand. But, Plato argues, there are some pleasures which are not only not good and not only not morally neutral, but which are downright base. He uses the example of sexual indulgence to a shameful degree. To take a different but equally topical example, the German language has a single word that means taking pleasure at someone else's pain or shame, Schadenfreude. It's a feeling that can often arise after a political season. This feeling, I submit, is an excellent example of a bad pleasure. In truth, we should love our enemies, willing their good, not reveling in their pain. Reveling in the pain of another evinces a defect of character. So the existence of bad pleasures shows that pleasure and the good are not the same. You cannot define the good as what is pleasant. Now, you might think Plato is being unfair to the hedonist. The hedonist didn't say that every pleasure was good, but just that our ultimate good is pleasure. So perhaps we have to forsake the small pleasures for the sake of the bigger ones. No pain, no gain. The hedonist gain being, of course, even larger pleasures than what we could get right now. To choose not to indulge sexually in fornication or adultery because we realize the immense pain that it would cause down the road, that would be an example of giving up an immediate pleasure for the sake of a larger, long-term one. Small pleasures aren't worth it if they bring bigger pains down the road. Epicurus, a more sane hedonist, thought exactly this. This is why he defended the utility of virtue. But I don't think Plato is being unfair. His examples show that considered in themselves and apart from bad or good consequences, some pleasures are intrinsically bad. And if that's the case, then, well, here's the punchline. There's a whole criteria of goodness or badness that is beyond the pleasure itself, and to which we appeal as we judge the pleasure to be good or bad. Some sexual activities are simply vile and degrading, regardless of whatever long-term pleasurable causes may or may not come from them. We would not say that someone who restlessly enjoyed them is truly happy and living a good life. Likewise, someone who is obsessed with, say, video games, plays them every moment, who loves them, is captivated with them, treasures them up in his heart. We would not say that that person is living a good life, no matter how much they enjoyed it. It's base. You can fill up your life with more and more pleasures, but that doesn't make them good. We have to evaluate pleasures based on some independent criteria of goodness. Here's a second argument that Plato uses. He contrasts the hedonists and the truly wise man through the image of two water jugs. So imagine one jug filled with holes and leaking all over. It constantly needs to be refilled. It has a lot of water flowing out of it, so you need to put a lot of water back into it if you're going to maintain any kind of constant level. It needs constant tending because of all the constant flow. That takes a lot of work. The other jar, in contrast, does not have any leaks. You fill it once, and it stays pretty full. You only have to refill it gradually over time after you use it. Which jar is better? Which jar has a better life? Well, the leaky jar is the hedonist, Plato argues, trying to cram in more and more pleasure as much as possible. To do this, he has to create space for that pleasure to fill up. But that space is painful. The appetites, the desires, the lusts that he lets get as big as possible. The bigger the lust, the more satiating when it is gratified. The hedonist says, give me more, let more and more flow in. But Plato, like Angelica Schuyler, says you will never be satisfied. The more you stretch your appetites, the greater the pain that you will create. Every pleasure comes as a satisfaction of a longing. So the longings grow proportionately with the pains, and you're not any better off. Instead, you're just tired. There are enough pains in this world without trying to make them any larger. The upshot of these arguments is that pleasure and goodness are not the same. The pleasing maker is not the good maker. To be good is not just to be pleasurable. The two can come apart. Now, that the two can come apart does not automatically mean that the highest good is not also, in the final analysis, what is in addition, the most pleasurable to contemplate and enjoy. But simply that in its essence, they're not the same. What it is to be is not the same. So, John Piper might still be right, and he is right, that our greatest happiness is found in eternal communion with and enjoyment of God. But enjoyment is still not the same thing as rectitude. Now, Plato is not against all pleasure, but he is against an awful lot of it. Why? Well, he thinks the attraction of physical pleasure is one of the primary reasons that we neglect to do what is good. We indulge in food, laziness, alcohol, drugs, sex, rather than doing what we ought. And learning to deny those pleasures is essential if you want to live a good human life. Still, he's not against all pleasures. Some pleasures can be helpful. The pleasures of prayer, of temperate feasting, which hopefully we'll engage in a fair amount of tonight. The pleasures of spirited intellectual conversation. How do you determine which pleasures to pursue and which to avoid? Plato argues again, you need something outside the pleasure itself to use to evaluate the pleasures, to see whether it's good or bad, whether it will lead to what's good or bad. It's the mind that must do this. Prudence and wisdom must inspect and examine. In his dialogues, the Gorgias and the Philebus, he argues that a true philosopher will pursue those pleasures that lead to virtue and avoid those that lead away from it. You can mix in some pleasure, but it must serve your pursuit of holiness, not detract from it. Let's turn now to the other view he argues against, the power-seeking view. And I think for the sake of time, I'll move through this section. So you'll have to buy the book if you want to see the whole thing, but the talk is lengthy as it is. One of the conclusions from his assessment of the power-seeking life is that true power, the kind of power we really care about in the end, requires wisdom. That you have to know what is truly good and have prudence to recognize the effective, practical means to achieve that good. So that he famously argues that virtue is wisdom. He also argues that true power requires virtue and that wisdom. So to move on now to what Plato's own proposal is for what the right way to live looks like. So now that we are discussing virtue, this brings us to Plato's alternative. Pleasure and power are not the good. To see the human good, we must contemplate human nature and ultimately the divine source of that nature. In a series of dialogues, but especially in the Gorgias and the Republic, Plato argues that goodness for each thing is determined by its nature. The goodness of each thing is determined by its nature. That is, each thing is good in a different way. Each thing is good as the kind of thing it is. Its form determines its end. What it is in an ideal sense is what it strives to be and what it ought to become. So horses are good through the possession of horse excellences that enable them to live the complete life of a horse. F-350 dualies are good through the possession of truck excellences that enable them to function with excellence. And it doesn't take much reflection to realize that what makes a horse excellent is not the same thing as what makes an F-350 excellent. They need different things in order to be good versions of what they are. They each become good in their own way when each of their respective parts is in its proper order, given its specific nature. When each part functions properly, with excellence. So too for human beings. Humans become good when each part of us performs its proper work. When the whole is harmoniously united in pursuit of its proper end. For human beings, this means the entire person must be subject to reason. Our passions, desires, thoughts, and actions must intentionally conform to what is rational. Aristotle famously defined man as a rational animal. Plato would agree with that. In the Republic, you may be familiar with this, Plato famously distinguishes between three parts of the soul: the appetite, the mind, and the spirited part. And when each part possesses its proper virtue, is rationally ordered, the four cardinal virtues come to be present: temperance, courage, prudence, and justice. Temperance, or moderation, is excellence with respect to appetite and the pleasures of the body. Courage is excellence with respect to pain, the willingness to suffer pain for the sake of the good. Prudence is excellence with respect to the mind, in thinking, deliberating, and knowing. Justice is full rectitude and emerges when each part is in its proper place. So these moral virtues are the excellences necessary for human beings to be good. They enable human beings to properly perform its function. The three parts of the soul are meant to be illustrative, not exhaustive. The principle is that each part of man must be subject to right reason, oriented to what is truly valuable and good, to what each thing is meant to be in virtue of its nature. Thus, wisdom and knowledge of being, of essences, of metaphysics, of human nature, is necessary in order to realize goodness in our lives. A doctor must know how a body should function if he is to restore health to it. And likewise, a pastor, a politician, a citizen must know how a soul should function if he is to restore health to that. The ethics depends on the metaphysics, and thus wisdom is essential to the ethical life. Now, many have taken umbrage at the idea that reason should rule the body and the non-rational parts of the soul. That's not just accepted by everyone. There are both modern, contemporary, and other critics of this idea. Some contemporary critics would include James K.A. Smith, author of a number of well-known books, the NYU psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who in his works has some criticisms of this idea in Plato. Going back further in history, David Hume and British empiricists, the early modern period, were critical of this kind of Platonist role for reason. But Plato seems to me to be right on this point. Passion by itself is blind. It points us towards good things in many cases, but it doesn't provide the ultimate criteria of when to commit and when not to. Do you follow that passion or do you restrain it? Only the spiritual and rational can direct that. The feeling of sympathy, for instance, can make us more attentive to a problem that someone is having. These feelings can be valuable for us. But what to do about it is something you have to discern with your mind. You have to look outside the experience of the sympathy or the pleasure or the fear or whatever else, and reflect on whether this passion ought to be followed at this time or not. So reason is often a slave to the passions, but it ought not be. This is not to say reason is perfect in us, certainly not. And sometimes our passions can alert us to things that reason wasn't noticing either. So there's certainly some dialectic there. I think a better Christian critique of Plato at this point would go like this. It's not enough to talk about the internal order in the soul. We instead have to come to be further ordered by something outside of ourselves, by God. Augustine, hundreds of years after Plato, would argue in exactly this way. He writes, and I'm going to quote at length now from City of God, Book 19, Augustine's critique of this strand of thinking. So he writes, though the soul may seem to rule the body admirably, and the reason rule the vices, if the soul and reason do not themselves obey God, as God has commanded them to serve him, they have no proper authority over the body and the vices. For what kind of mistress of the body and the vices can that mind be, which is ignorant of the true God, and which, instead of being subject to his authority, is prostituted to the corrupting influences of the most vicious demons? It is for this reason that the virtues which it seems itself to possess, and by which it restrains the body, as the vices that it may obtain and keep what it desires. Sorry, I misread that. It's for this reason that the virtues which it seems to itself to possess, and by which it restrains the body and the vices, so that it may obtain and keep what it desires, these virtues are rather vices, so long as there is no reference to God in the matter. Although some suppose that virtues which have a reference only to themselves and are desired only on their own account are yet true and genuine virtues, the fact is that even then they are inflated with pride. They are therefore to be reckoned vices rather than virtues. For as that which gives life to the flesh is not derived from flesh but is above it, so that which gives a blessed life to man is not derived from man, but is something above him. And what I say of man is true of every celestial power and virtue whatsoever. That's Augustine, City of God, Book 19. So virtue is valuable, and Augustine himself even singles out the 4 cardinal virtues for special approval and endorsement. But true and complete virtue come from God alone. Seeking to be virtuous entirely in our own power, as if our own reason is sufficient to know the good and to restrain our passions, to guide our lives to full happiness, is pride. As limited human beings, fallen and redeemed by God, we must be led by God's wisdom, submitting ourselves to Him in humility. And since our own vision can see only so far, we must rely on His law, for He can see all. Plato himself is actually sympathetic to this critique, and I'll return to this at the very end of the talk. So I had promised to talk about politics and government also. Let me do that now before time is over. Government, Plato thinks, is generally used to procure pleasure and power. That's what Athens was doing, and it was a mistake. Instead, the state should aim at the same thing the individual should aim at, which is what every rational creature should aim at: making things as good as possible. The city should seek to become properly ordered as a city, with each part doing its proper work, not seeking to unjustly take to itself the things that belong to others, but with moderation pursuing their natural ends. Just as Plato famously divided the soul into 3 parts in the Republic, so too he divides the city into 3 parts, with workers, the guardian soldiers, and the ruling elite. The ideal workers are temperate. The ideal guardian soldiers are courageous. And the ideal ruling elite are prudent and wise. When all perform their function with excellence, the city is just, virtuous, and good. For good government, the kings must become philosophers, or the philosophers must become kings. Now, I think in the end, it's a bit of a shame that Plato's become known for these 3 parts of the city, this one piece of his story in the Republic. They're really not what's most interesting about his view. So here's what I think is most interesting about his view, or at least a few things that are more interesting about his view, both in the Republic and what the view turns into by his later dialogues. Here's the first. Plato emphasizes that external order depends on internal order. From the desires and affections of the heart comes the actions of a man, and the interactions of one man with another. In a crucial passage in the Republic, Plato writes that justice is concerned with what is inside, with himself really, and I'm quoting now, with himself really, that's what justice is about, and with the things that are his own. It means he doesn't allow the elements in him each to do the job of the other, or the 3 sorts of elements in his soul to meddle with one another. Instead, he regulates well what is really his own, rules himself, puts himself in order, becomes his own friend, and harmonizes the 3 elements together, just as if they were literally the 3 defining notes of an octave: lowest, highest, and middle. He binds together all of these, and from having been many, becomes entirely one, temperate and harmonious. Then and only then should he turn to action, whether it is to do something concerning the acquisition of wealth, or concerning the care of the body, or something political, or concerning private contracts. Later on in the Republic, as he considers different ways a city can be organized, he emphasizes that the defects in various different cities arise from their internal defects of character. When citizens are greedy, the state will be greedy. If the citizens are cowards, the city as a whole will be unable to defend itself with vigor. The character of a city is determined by the character of the individuals. External order depends upon internal order. And you can't get the external right if you don't get the internal right. He says the first problem for all of us is what's going on in our souls. The first problem is not what people out there are doing to you, but what we are doing to ourselves. That is the first thing to address. So here's the answer to his puzzle as a young man. How can a city be governed properly? Only if those who have a share of ruling in the city become themselves properly internally governed. You must govern yourself, your own passions, your own appetites, if you want to be an effective leader in a community. If you don't, your own personal defects will pour out into the world. You'll yell at your kids. You'll steal from your boss. You'll lie on your resume. Backstab your rival. Healthy communities are built on healthy individuals. To have a virtuous government, build virtuous people. Good government begins with self-government. This explains Plato's turn away from politics and towards philosophy. Without wisdom, no state can be properly governed. If everyone is vicious, ethical reform must be the first piece on the agenda. Now, here's a second thing that Plato should be better known for. In his later writings, he shifts from an emphasis on the philosopher kings, so important in the Republic, to an emphasis on the rule of law. The final work that Plato was writing at the time of his death is a work called The Laws. I call it Republic 2.0. In that dialogue, the characters create another imaginary city, but this time it looks a bit more practical and perhaps possible to realize than the one in the Republic. He still thinks it's crucial that leaders be people of character, but he's much more attuned to the practicalities that must also be in place. Most important of these are the division of power and the rule of law. No matter how good a man is, Plato argues, he should not be entrusted with absolute power. So there's no really, in the Republic, there's not really discussion of any limitations on what these super philosopher kings can do or how they do it or so forth. But in the Laws, he's much more concerned with unrestrained power vested in an individual. He says, only if we could have a God come and dwell among us would we be wise to do that. Only God can be entrusted with absolute power. Humans must rule under God in a limited fashion, appropriate to their limited conditions in the family and in the city. So Plato creates a wide range of offices and councils and highly diversifies the power in this city. No one group rules. The group with the most power is a small council of elders, very old, and they can veto all sorts of things and deal with the most important matters. In the end, he actually even says that a good regime ought to be a kind of theocracy. God is the ruler. The people are his servants, and no man can take the place of God. When we try, we cause disaster. For this reason also, the rule of law is essential. The rulers of the city are to be the servants of the laws, and the laws stand above every man, including above every ruler, as a reflection ultimately of the divine will. They set a vision for a pattern of life that is good and right. Respect and submissiveness to the law must be cultivated. Responsibility for proper order in the laws is no longer vested solely in the character of the leaders, but also in the sturdiness of sound law. Some people worry that Plato's view is totalitarian. There are a number of reasons that this comes up in the Republic as it's read. The three different classes of citizens in the Republic are apparently managed in a top-down fashion, different people assigned to work jobs that are suited to them by nature. The guardian and ruling elite classes seem to exercise government over everyone else, making them do what they're told. The laws, I think, softens the totalitarianism quite a bit. No longer is there a godlike philosopher king, there is only the servant of the laws, which reign over everyone equally. But it must be said, Plato's state is certainly still anti-liberal. It is set up from top to bottom not to maximize personal freedom or protect rights, but rather to instill good character. A regime which maximizes freedom, Plato thinks, will also maximize license and vice. He thinks this was one of the main mistakes that Athens made. They let people do whatever they wanted when it came to education, music, the arts, involvement in civil society, and so forth. The results were greed and power politicking. Instead, he thinks communities must be intentionally formed around a shared vision of flourishing derived from a transcendent source. The state cannot afford to be value neutral, but must exist under God in its own culturally distinctive way. With that being said, totalitarian micromanagement is still not the goal. The goal is to govern through persuasion. A final distinctive of this city that's imagined in Plato's laws is that every single law will have attached to it, preceding it, a statement of the reason why the law is being made and why the law is good. All citizens will be able to see, here's why this is good. Listen, accept, and obey, in the hopes that their own minds will come to agreement. That homonoia, thinking together, like-mindedness, will be present in the city. That, I think, is the opposite of totalitarian. Plato recognizes no city is perfect. He even says the more realistic ideal city of the laws is still very ideal. Take whatever regime you're working with. Move it gradually in that direction, in a way that fits the character and spirit of your own people. So Platonic politics is about helping the citizens develop their full humanity, capable of free and voluntary action for the sake of the good, and pursuing together a common good for all, not for one part, but for the whole, binding them together harmoniously to make them one, like a beautiful chord or a piece of music. I'm saving a full exploration of Plato's theology for my final lecture, but I'd be remiss if I concluded the talk at this point. Don't worry, I am about to conclude. Because so far the talk doesn't do justice to the central place that Plato gives to God in his ethics. And again, reserving some space for the final lecture to say more about this, I want to say at least a little bit more now. There are at least two ways, even looking at the political life, that God is central to life. First, Plato argues, as his subjects, we owe honor and submission to God. We are even his slaves, he says, in the Phaedo and in the laws, and so our lives should be in service to him. And second, God is central to life because he himself is the original true good and the original true reason. All other things are obligated to become good like him. He's the pattern. How does that square with his earlier argument about proper ordering? Well, very easily. To be properly ordered, what is human must be ordered to what is divine. Our original source is in the heavens, and our destiny lies in the heavens. At the end of the Gorgias, a combative dialogue between Socrates and some bitter critics. The Gorgias is one of the most, has the most vicious discussion between the interlocutors. They're very tough on each other. Socrates tells his opponents, "You know how to speak in law courts, and you would probably win in the contest of speeches in front of a jury." Plato writes this with deep irony, right, knowing that Socrates, of course, is found guilty in front of a jury and executed. But Socrates argues at the end of the Gorgias, there is a different court coming and a different judge who sits in judgment. When we all die, our souls are stripped bare, and we come before God himself, who gazes upon our naked souls, seeing all the good and all the bad. And in that contest, the contest of righteousness, Socrates says he will come out the victor. He may not be protected from a human jury, but he will be protected from the divine judge, for he is purifying his soul in preparation for that day. The The final contest, the ultimate speeches, are about holiness, righteousness, and goodness. The man who seeks those things will not be disappointed. Plato didn't know, and I don't think could really imagine, that God would stoop down to dwell among us, to take on human nature, to live and die as a sacrifice in our place, to reconcile ourselves to him, that we might truly become holy. I don't think he could see that God's Spirit would come all the way down and fill our hearts, so that instead of climbing up to God in our own power, we can be brought up to his presence by his supreme love. Thank you.